I suppose I'm going to try and cover again some things that are a bit different to what Pacty said, but I think he's right. And I think in the pandemic, it's felt to me like a concertina where we did. I've used a number of analogies in speaking to people. At times it's felt a bit like the Tour de France, so it's felt like some days we climb mountains, other days we do sprints, some days we do them both one after the other at the same time. So there has been an awful lot of challenge in managing that balance between what you might call clarity of purpose from leaders and the marshalling of all the great innovations that have been done by practitioners, and to try and marry that into a system. And so if you can create, in terms of leadership and management, if you can create those systems that admit that permission to create and to go forward and reach people, I think that's definitely the trick to this. So I suppose it's a structured approach to listening, as Pacty says, on behalf of practitioners and school leaders. It's trying to build that shared understanding about what needs to be done, that coherence in Pacty's language, which I agree with. And then being prepared to be accountable for decision making, because there have been moments in the pandemic where I think probably some of the decisions we've had to take have required a bit of explication to people, and I think it's been right and proper that we've held ourselves to account for that. So you need to create context where you can meet people and talk to them and establish those collaborative platforms and partnerships, and make sure the action you take you follow through on, that you absolutely make it your business. If you've decided something is important, you must make sure you deliver on it, and throughout assiduously communicate. So, for example, for me, one of the best things that's come out of the pandemic is the structured approach we've taken to managing stakeholder communication. I now have stakeholder forums with parents and pupils that I never really had prior to the pandemic, and certainly people come to them digitally more easily than they might have done if they'd had to come and meet me in Motherwell, for example, whereas they can reach me much more quickly digitally, so therefore I can be more available, and that creates other challenges, of course, as well. So I have to be prepared to answer for things we're doing, and then I can also be a conduit for information back to schools about things I find out, and that can be challenging for the schools, can be challenging for me, but it's right and proper we listen. I'll give you an example. 2 weeks ago I'm on a call with 75 parent council chairs from across North Lanarkshire, which wouldn't have happened before, because I would have struggled to get maybe 20 or 30 of them to come and meet me one night in a cold winter's evening, say in Motherwell or Coatbridge. But I can get 75 of them onto a video call, which is amazing. And every 3 or 4 weeks I meet with a pupil forum from across our schools, and I meet with a stakeholder forum for schools, and I also meet with ASN parent council chairs, and some of the stories I hear from them, especially because their children tend to have very complex needs and to be very vulnerable, are pretty traumatic and quite harrowing, inspiring, but it's a good lesson for me in terms of what people during this pandemic are going through when they're managing those most vulnerable children. So I suppose the first thing I would say to everybody is to listen and to create the context in which you can listen and build that picture. And then on the partnership side, I do believe, Caroline, that what's becoming clear is that if the pandemic's done anything, as Pacty says, the system needs to see the children first. And everything else is just complementary specialisms. It's just people working together. But the children must come first. What they need should drive everything. So, in Pacty's words again, this is about the children of our country in the future. This is about making sure we have things in place for them, and we have to have a burning.
Okay, thank you very much for your question. So, I think the short answer to that would be professional learning is critical, it's foundational, is one of the most important things that we teachers can and should do. I suppose during the pandemic, we will do a lot of things that is kind of first response of some sort. Because we have to. There's not too much time to think too carefully. But I suppose once after the pandemic, or we have come to a certain level of stability, we need to look back, be much more reflective, and that is that part about professional learning. What has worked? What has not worked? What could be done better? And not only that, it's at different levels. At teacher level, at kind of like department level in the school, at the school level, but it could be higher than that. I think there are different layers of learning, and we should all be looking at these. But the learning ought to be twofold. One is called sharing of practices. That is to say, the professional learning need not just be all about learning from sort of research and so on. That is important, that has its place. But I think a lot of things happen on the ground. We need some time to really consolidate, think through what has worked, what has not worked, and do that professional sharing across the whole country. Then the other thing is that in doing so, we also need to be highly reflective, because some things that may have worked may no longer be relevant in the future. And so we have to be very selective as well. So professional learning is critical, but because we're talking about relationships, professional learning should be collaborative as well. That, I think, should be something that as we work together as different stakeholders, all taking a stake in education, we should come not only to a point of having that sort of sharing of practices, but also at the same time, a few things. One, reaffirming the fundamental purpose of why we're doing what we're doing. What is it for? Do we all share that common goal? Even if we come from different perspectives, we may have different opinions of what should be done or how it's to be done, but do we have a common goal? Next, then we ask, can we be much more reflective? Next, we also ask, can we learn to be a lot more understanding of one another? If that can all go into professional learning, I think that sort of professional learning will be great. Thank you very much.
Well, I agree with Bhakti. I do think it's foundational, fundamental, crucial professional learning. I'm going to say it needs to be practitioner-centred. And I think we're in a phase of development right now where the world has shrunk immeasurably due to the impact of digital communication and the way in which we've all had to work through the pandemic. So I think the opportunities are immense for us to really redouble our efforts to commit ourselves to high quality digital learning. So I'll give you one or two examples. We have, and I'm going to use the word trained, we've trained or provided professional learning for 3,000 teachers since January in aspects of digital learning. Some of that I would say is training about skills and capacity building, but now we're moving into a phase where we're really engaging much more creative learning pedagogy and the quality of feedback team. But when Pat talks about the purpose and the narrative and the way in which he talks about what we want to commit ourselves to in the future and that common goal, I just feel as though there's a real opportunity in Scotland to strengthen that, and that should underpin the activity, and that we should have that kind of going forward, that real strength and sense of purpose. I think we need to be ambitious. I think we need to do more to foster the creative and critical thinking of our young people and to plan for the future of our country. And I would say we want to be more grounded in our intellectual traditions in Scotland, which have been about breadth of understanding, inquiry, invention. I don't think we've talked enough about that in recent times, and I think emerging from the pandemic, we want to be bold, and the CLPL should really be about two things. Awareness raising and consciousness raising of teachers in terms of their professional understanding of themselves as citizens of the world who are training future citizens of the world. but also about the technical skills of teachers to be able to participate at a high level. And I suppose hopefully that augments and builds on what he was saying, because I actually think I agree with everything he said, and especially that last bit about the, just encouraging and helping people to be empathetic in the dealing with whatever the young people bring us post this pandemic.
Although I have, over the past 1 or 2 weeks in preparation to have this dialogue, click on certain web links in order to find out more about what the media has been saying about Scottish education, about this called loss of learning. But I would not claim that I have that insider knowledge. So let me comment in this way. I'll say that in very general terms, there could be loss, but there is gain as well. It depends on what we are referring to. Loss of learning, if we try too hard to say, no, there isn't, maybe there is. But the thing is that, what exactly are we referring to? It could be a loss in terms of learning of mathematics, science, languages, perhaps, maybe. That is a big question mark. We don't know, perhaps. But we seldom really hear from ourselves even, not just from the media, about telling them and telling the society that we actually have great teachers, great schools, great children that we are helping, and who says that there's a learning loss. It depends on what you mean by learning. A lot of children are learning great things during the pandemic. And it is once a lifetime kind of chance, although we would never hope for a pandemic to come, but to live through a pandemic and to be able to still carry on, now that is great learning. Therefore, I would probably say something like that in response. One is to question ourselves, why is it that as a society, some media, if you put it that way, they are so hyped up about learning loss? Is that so critically important? Because that shows who we are as a people. Why are certain segments of the society so hung up by so-called learning loss? Isn't that a great reflection question for all of us? And what sort of loss are they talking about? Is it about mathematics results, science results, examination results? Have they not had the lenses to see it from the other way around, that, wow, our schools are resilient, our teachers are resilient, our children are resilient? Why are we not seeing a much more balanced picture? Now, these are great things that schools in Scotland are doing for the children, for the families, working with other stakeholders. Why do we do more of these and show them? And not only that, why don't we as educators stand up tall? I'm not saying that we are not doing it, but let us stand up tall and really tell them, is it so important? Do you not have the lenses to see another side to the story? And why don't you take out your mobile now, go to Twitter and fill up the Twitter space with really positive things, positive messages about what we educators do, what we stand for, and how we go out for every child? Why don't we all do that?
So I always find Patrick inspiring when I hear him speak, and I think I loved hearing that. I want to say that first. Carol, I think the question comes from a really passionate place. I think there's a kind of sense of frustration in there that some of the good things we've done might get lost in a kind of a media narrative which is negative, and I think we need to be just a couple of points around about learning loss. So I do think there are things we need to just try to quantify to try and work out if there is any particular loss for individual groups. In fact, he's mentioned some traumatic things before. It might just be more complex than just maybe literacy and numeracy, and how we might measure that through the normal tools. Could, for example, be the emotional preparation our young children are missing for entry into primary one, or into children's entry over the transition into secondary, which I think our schools were telling me from August, September were issues. So therefore it becomes an issue for me. And I would think that would be a bit of learning loss we'd want to quantify, that preparation for change as part of child development. I don't think we can disregard that. But if we can quantify if there has been any kind of loss in terms of progression or attainment, I think we'd want to do that. So data can help with addressing myths as well. And just to try and build an evidence base for what we want to do, I think could be quite important. But then what we need to do then has to be tailored to circumstances. What I thought was interesting about the question in particular was some of the language around about well-being, I think, is something we should consider as a country. Because sometimes when I hear people talking about trauma-informed practice, or I hear people talking about building resilience, it's almost as though these are two ideologies which are in competition with one another. And I don't think either ideology is wrong, and I don't think either ideology is enough. I think we need a bigger and more purposeful approach to promoting a holistic approach to well-being that can reach people. And I do think we should be thinking about the whole child and the whole person, and accepting that there can be trauma in there, and that might need a particular approach. But by and large, we want people to live as independently as possible and be as positive about their future as we can. So I do think we're at a moment, at this point, as we emerge from the pandemic, there's a moment where we can really help our children to know themselves better and to grow to know themselves better. And I'm quoting here Alan McLean, the psychologist, so I'm definitely wanting to just kind of make people aware. That's a quotation. But I do think we want to try and help people to deal with the emotional experience of the pandemic, and to try and turn it into as much of a positive thing as we can, without underestimating the fact that some people are going through some pretty horrific things during the pandemic as well. So I always think, try and quantify the problem, try and qualify what you want to do about it, and try and build a purpose out of what you can get evidence that you know. But I do agree how we manage the stories are important, and I think back to his a call to arms, if you like, in terms of encouraging us all to be positive and get positive messages out there. I definitely think we should think very, very seriously.
So thanks very much for the question. So how could we actually ensure something like that? So firstly, key phrase, positive relationships. Definitely when we just merely in the school, okay, if we work together in the school, there's bound to be a relationship. Question whether it's actually positive or not so positive. So positive relationships start off with ourselves, being sincere and sincere over time. People interact with us. They know that we are sincere, and we have always been sincere. Then, even if we have different opinions, we know that we can actually have a good chat, and sometimes even agree to disagree. But we are still on the same side, because we are working on a common purpose, and that is educating our next generation. So relationships start off with sincerity over time, and the basis is the common purpose. That sincerity, that being authentic over time. Next, then we need to build platforms for communications to continue and to thrive. So during the pandemic, for example, people have gone out to try to serve the community, and we have built some of these communication channels that are based on, say, Zoom or whatever. Some of these ought to be kept after the pandemic. Those relationships have been built, and we should continue those practices. But the form, the frequency, the things that we discuss may change, but those relationships will not change. And I think fundamentally we have to remind ourselves that if we really want to look after children, the needs of the children cannot be fully provided by just schools alone. There are many other services that we need. It is a kind of a whole society approach. But we schools, we educators play a major role. And we can play this major role and play this facilitative role. By being educators, be sincere to our task, be believing and passionate about education, we bring other people in to join us in providing for our young people. So, in short, how do we ensure that such positive relationships continue are at the heart of all areas? Then, in summary, 1, come back to the common purpose. It is always to educate the young for the future of the nation. 2, be sincere, be authentic over time. We can agree to disagree about how we achieve things, but we do not disagree that it is for the good of the children. Next, then let's build those platforms even after the pandemic, capitalizing on what we have already done, and let's do better with them. Thank you.
Yeah, so it's really interesting just hearing the language that PACT uses to describe, and I think my answer is actually kind of similar. Gavin, for me this is a question about leadership, so I have a few things to say. First of all, the best examples I've seen of school improvement are grounded, and to be honest, the really very best ones are grounded in ethos and enable everybody to be involved and participate. There are loads of ways to do it, but I always tell people it's really important to try and generate some kind of evidence base for what you want to do, and to take time to listen to people and build that shared coherent understanding of what's needed in the community, and that whole societal approach I think is something fantastic if you can tap into it. Some people are really inspirational in this area of ethos-based school improvement, but you certainly need to be methodical. If you want to aspire to be inspirational, first be methodical. But listening to PACT talking about authenticity, I do think the integrity of the leadership and driving things forward is really crucial. That's got to be rooted in the values of the leadership, that the people need to proceed with some conviction whilst taking time to build that understanding and to listen to people and work that in. That's back to PACT's issue of the top down versus the kind of bottom up and trying to manage that in. I definitely think you need to manage what I'm going to call healthy dissent, which I think is part of a system improvement, and show composure in how you deal with that. And I think you need to energise your team and build community, and you need to reach people with something really positive that you want to say about the future of the children. For me, ethos and improvement absolutely interlinked, and a lot about how you lead and you involve people.
Thank you very much. And I suppose it will be both more difficult and in some ways much easier. So merely as an anecdote, of course that's some 30-something years ago, I was an undergraduate in your country. So I was an undergraduate in your country at that point in time. In order to connect back with my parents in Singapore, so what do? And you must remember, British telecoms is very expensive, at least with respect to me. The British pound was so big then, so what do we have to do? A call is about just 1 minute. It's about £3.50. And at that time, 1 minute, £3.50 is a lot of money for an undergraduate like myself. Today, with Zoom, with WhatsApp, it's easy. And therefore, the connection is definitely much better. But on the other hand, the difficulty could be this. In the digital world, we start forgetting the importance of the human touch. And therefore, I think it is a very balanced sort of message down here. It is both easier and harder. We have to capitalize on what the digital devices and this connectivity afford to us. We have to capitalize on those. But on the other hand, we must remember that we are actually human. And education is actually a very human enterprise. People affecting people positively. Therefore, the human touch must still be there and not be lost. So I would say that we should capitalize on ICT, and a lot of things now, it's not just during the pandemic, after the pandemic. If I have to speak with you in the past, before the pandemic, the usual assumption would be what? That I would have to fly to Scotland. But now, today, when anybody kind of write an email to me and say, Party, could you please speak with, speak at our conference or whatever? The mindset has changed. Today, if I receive an email like that, immediately, without even the person mentioning, I know that the person meant through Teams, through Zoom, or one of those. And if not for these ICT affordances, definitely we cannot connect. But in connecting, especially when we work in the school, that human touch is absolutely crucial, because human beings are not exactly inspired by machinery. Even if that's great, that inspiration will not live long. We are inspired by a fellow human being, a fellow person who stands for something great. And that is what I think. It is both harder and easier. Thank you.
Yeah, I actually agree. I do think the context is limiting in some ways, but can also have advantages. So I suppose it allows a greater efficiency to do things as, in a certain way that's allowed greater connectivity with people, and that's been fantastic. And I think in terms of my own team's work and working with the schools and the teachers and the trade unions, I think we've been able to manage through very quickly a lot of response in terms of kind of building systems in real time to cope with issues. The issuing of e-vouchers for preschool meal children, for example, we'd had that in place within a week or 2 weeks in North Lanarkshire. Our community hubs that went in a day after the lockdown started. So a lot of things were possible because of the digital environment, and including digital learning. We've had about 500,000 people through our virtual classroom in North Lanarkshire now, which has been quite an incredible thing since Christmas. So it's created the urgency of the pandemic, as Pacty's kind of suggested, has created that context that enabled a lot of digital activity, which became very purposeful, and that helped the teamwork, and that helped us move on. But I do think in terms of reaching people, there are limitations, and this is about well-being of the people you work with, your colleagues. There are people who are working in key positions in our authority that I've not met in person, just simply because in the last year I've not had the chance to sit down with them, which is quite surreal actually. And the only way I can talk to them is if I create meetings and processes to allow them to speak to me, so that I can find out what they're like and get to know them a bit. You have to work hard to hear the voices when you're working remotely. And then also I've been in situations where you have to have challenging conversations, and you're doing that online as well, and you have to be really careful when words are prisoners in this context. And and when you can be sitting at home experiencing a lot of frustration and pressure, but then others are feeling that as well. So there is a bit about leading with empathy and understanding, recognising that you're trying to build a community, you're trying to do what you can, in a difficult circumstance to reach people, and that people might be feeling that as well. So you have to try and just think about how's this going to play out when I say this following thing. But ultimately as well, the last thing I want to say is I talk a lot about how proud I am of people that I work with, I'm conscious of the fact that I might be the only person that's telling them that in any given day, and I'm trying to balance optimism and realism. And I'm trying to kind of create a context where people are purposeful and that's grounded in a hope that we can actually get through it and make the system better as we go along. And I think it is probably important to just end with that message of hope. And probably, I notice comments in the chat bar about moral purpose. I do think that's at the heart of what we're trying to do here.